I still remember the day I stumbled upon Kelsi Davies' estate like it was yesterday. It was a chilly autumn morning, and the trees surrounding her property were ablaze with vibrant hues of orange and red. As a collector of rare antiquities, I had been tracking Kelsi's extensive collection of occult books for months. She was an enigmatic figure, rarely seen in public, but her reputation as a scholar of the dark arts was well known among aficionados. What drew me to her estate was not only the promise of acquiring some of the most forbidden texts on the planet, but also rumors of Kelsi's own involvement with these ancient practices. As I approached the entrance of her mansion, an eerie feeling crept over me. The once grand facade now seemed shrouded in a melancholic aura, as if it had been veiled by time itself. The air was heavy with an unsettling silence, punctuated only by the distant chirping of crickets and the soft whispering of wind through barren trees. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was trespassing on something deeply personal, something Kelsi herself had left untouched for years. Upon entering the mansion, I found myself surrounded by shelves upon shelves of dusty books, their covers adorned with strange symbols and markings that seemed to dance in the dim light. Each tome spoke of a different era, of various cults and sects that had delved into the darkness, seeking power beyond mortal comprehension. It was as if Kelsi had spent her life collecting not only texts, but also fragments of souls. In the center of this vast library stood an enormous, leather-bound book, adorned with what looked like blood stains. Its cover seemed to pulsate with a malevolent energy that drew me in against my will. I knew then that I had found the heart of Kelsi's collection, and it was here that our journey into the depths of her dark occult would begin. As I delicately opened the cover of the leather-bound book, a musty smell wafted up, carrying with it whispers of ancient rituals and forgotten knowledge. The pages, yellowed with age, revealed intricate illustrations that seemed to shift in the dim light, like the shadows on a moonless night. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I turned the pages, uncovering passages written in languages I didn't understand. The words themselves appeared to dance across the page, weaving a spell of unease and curiosity. It was as if Kelsi had poured her very soul into these texts, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that led me deeper into the heart of darkness. Suddenly, I heard a faint creaking sound coming from the hallway. It sounded like the soft closing of a door, but it was too quiet, too deliberate. My heart skipped a beat as I realized I wasn't alone in the mansion. A figure emerged from the shadows, her presence both captivating and unnerving. Kelsi Davies herself stood before me, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her smile was a whispered secret, one that seemed to hold 1,000 unseen terrors. "Welcome," she said, her voice husky and low, like the rustling of dry leaves. "I see you found my little treasure trove." She gestured to the book in my hand, her eyes glinting with a knowing light that made me wonder if she had been watching me from the shadows all along. As I handed the book over to Kelsi, she took it with a reverence that bordered on worship. Her fingers brushed against mine, sending shivers down my spine as if I had come into contact with something inherently evil. "This one's a rare find," she said, her voice dripping with an otherworldly enthusiasm. "A text from the forgotten era of the Erebus cult." She opened the book, revealing pages that seemed to be written in a language I didn't understand. But as I peered closer, I saw that the words were shifting, rearranging themselves into a message that made my blood run cold. "Those who read me shall know the darkness that lies within." Kelsi's eyes locked onto mine, and for an instant I felt like she was seeing right through to my very soul. "I think it's time we took this little treasure back to your humble abode," she said, her smile twisted into a grotesque parody of warmth. As we left the mansion, the air seemed to thicken, heavy with an unseen presence that watched us from the shadows. I couldn't shake off the feeling that I had just made a pact with a malevolent force, one that would slowly consume me from the inside out. The book felt heavy in my backpack, its weight pressing against my shoulders like a physical manifestation of the horrors it contained. I knew then that I was in over my head, trapped in a web of darkness from which there was no escape. As I delved deeper into the book's content, unsettling discoveries began to surface. The text spoke of rituals that involved human sacrifice, and the pages were adorned with illustrations of twisted creatures that seemed to writhe off the page. I felt a creeping sense of dread as I turned the pages, the words seeming to sear themselves into my mind. Kelsi watched me with an unnerving intensity, her eyes gleaming with a knowing light that made me wonder if she was more than just a collector of rare texts. One passage in particular caught my eye. The veil between worlds is thinning, and the creatures that lurk beyond are growing restless. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words, the air around me seeming to vibrate with an otherworldly energy. Suddenly, Kelsi's voice cut through the silence, her tone dripping with a sinister excitement. "You see, the book is more than just a collection of ancient texts. It's a key to unlocking the secrets of the unknown." She paused, her eyes glinting with a malevolent light. "And I think you're ready to unlock them." As she spoke, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening into twisted, living things that writhed across the walls. I knew then that I was in grave danger, trapped in a web of horrors from which there was no escape. The book seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, its words burning themselves into my mind like a brand. As I delved deeper into the book's secrets, the weight of forbidden knowledge began to bear down on me like a physical force. My mind reeled with the implications of what I had discovered, and the more I read, the more my grip on reality seemed to slip. Kelsi watched me with an unnerving intensity, her eyes gleaming with a knowing light that made me wonder if she was more than just a collector of rare texts. One night, as I pored over the book in my dimly lit study, I felt the darkness closing in around me. The words on the page seemed to blur and shift, like a madman's scrawl, and I knew that I was being drawn into a realm where sanity was a distant memory. The air was thick with an otherworldly presence, and I could feel eyes upon me, watching me from the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it only grew stronger until I felt like I was drowning in a sea of madness. And then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the edge of perception, its face twisted into a grimace of malevolent glee. I knew then that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The weight of forbidden knowledge had taken its toll on my mental state, and I was no longer sure what was real and what was just a product of my own fevered imagination. Kelsi's voice whispered in my ear, her breath cold against my skin. "You should have left it alone," she said, her eyes glinting with a malevolent light. And then everything went black. As I emerged from the depths of madness, I was met with a world that seemed distorted and twisted. The lines between reality and delusion had grown fuzzy, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that I was being pulled apart by unseen forces. My mind was a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts and emotions, and I knew that I was teetering on the edge of collapse. Kelsi's face was etched into my brain like a branding iron, her eyes burning with an otherworldly intensity that made my skin crawl. I couldn't escape the feeling that she was watching me, waiting for me to unravel completely. The book, once a source of fascination and horror, now seemed like a ticking time bomb, its secrets threatening to consume me whole. I tried to focus on the world around me, but everything seemed to be shifting and flowing like a liquid. The furniture in my study was different, the colors more muted, and the air was thick with an otherworldly presence that made my skin prickle with unease. I knew then that I had crossed a line from which there was no return. The first signs of madness had begun to appear, and I was powerless to stop them. My grip on reality was tenuous at best, and I could feel myself being pulled down into the abyss of insanity. Kelsi's voice whispered in my ear, her words like a mantra that repeated itself over and over. "You should have left it alone." And then, everything went black once more. As I descended deeper into the dark world, the air grew thick with an otherworldly energy. The shadows seemed to twist and writhe around me, like living things that pulsed with a malevolent life of their own. I could feel the weight of ancient powers bearing down upon me, the whispers of forgotten deities echoing through my mind like a madman's laughter. Kelsi was by my side, her eyes aglow with an unnatural light that seemed to pierce the very soul. Together, we delved deeper into the heart of madness, the world around us dissolving into a realm of surreal horrors. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches grasping for me like skeletal fingers. The sky was a deep, bloody red, and the stars shone with a malevolent glow that seemed to sear itself into my retina. I knew then that we had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The dark world was alive, and it was hungry. It reached out with tendrils of darkness, wrapping around me like a shroud. I felt myself being drawn into its depths, the gravity of the abyss pulling me inexorably down. And yet, despite the terror that gripped my heart, I knew that I had to see this through. For in the dark world there was only one truth. Madness was the ultimate reality. The superhuman entities waited for us, their presence a cold wind that cut through the darkness like a scythe. I could feel their eyes upon me, watching and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, everything went black once more. As I emerged from the depths of the dark world, I found myself standing at the threshold of an ancient ritual site. The air was thick with the scent of incense and blood, and the sky seemed to burn with a fiery intensity that made my skin prickle with unease. Kelsi stood before me, her eyes aglow with an otherworldly light as she began to chant in a language that sounded like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The words echoed through the site, summoning forth forces that lurked beyond the veil of sanity. I watched in horror as Kelsi's body began to change, her form contorting and twisting like a living thing that was no longer bound by the laws of mortal men. Her skin turned a sickly shade of green, and her eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to consume her very soul. The ritual had begun, and I knew that I was powerless to stop it. The sacrifices were being performed, and I could feel the weight of their suffering bearing down upon me like a physical force. My own sanity began to fray at the edges, as if the very fabric of my mind was being torn apart by the eldritch horrors that lurked beyond the threshold. Kelsi's voice rose to a crescendo, the words pouring forth from her lips like a torrent of madness that threatened to consume us all. And then, in an instant, it was over. The ritual was complete, and I found myself standing alone at the edge of the site, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had witnessed. Kelsi's body lay before me, her form reduced to a twisted, nightmarish parody of its former self. And yet, despite the horror that I felt, I knew that I could not look away. For in that moment, I realized that I was no longer sure which side of the veil I stood on. Was I still sane, or had I crossed over into the realm of the mad? As I stood before the ritual site, I felt the boundaries between reality and madness blur. The air was thick with the scent of incense and blood, and the sky seemed to burn with a fiery intensity that made my skin prickle with unease. Kelsi's eyes gleamed with an otherworldly light as she began to chant in a language that sounded like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. The words echoed through the site, summoning forth forces that lurked beyond the veil of sanity. I watched in horror as Kelsi's body began to change, her form contorting and twisting like a living thing that was no longer bound by the laws of mortal men. Her skin turned a sickly shade of green, and her eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to consume her very soul. The ritual had begun, and I knew that I was powerless to stop it. The sacrifices were being performed, and I could feel the weight of their suffering bearing down upon me like a physical force. My own sanity began to fray at the edges, as if the very fabric of my mind was being torn apart by the eldritch horrors that lurked beyond the threshold. Kelsi's voice rose to a crescendo, the words pouring forth from her lips like a torrent of madness that threatened to consume us all. And then, in an instant, it was over. The ritual was complete, and I found myself standing alone at the edge of the site, my mind reeling with the implications of what I had witnessed. I looked down at Kelsi's body, her form reduced to a twisted, nightmarish parody of its former self. And yet, despite the horror that I felt, I knew that I could not look away. For in that moment, I realized that I was no longer sure which side of the veil I stood on. Was I still sane, or had I crossed over into the realm of the mad? The lines between reality and madness blurred further as I looked around at the twisted, nightmarish landscape. The trees seemed to writhe and twist, their branches grasping for me like skeletal fingers. The sky was a deep, bloody red, and the stars shone with an unnatural glow that seemed to pierce the very soul. I knew then that I had to make a choice. Would I continue down the path of madness, or would I find a way to reclaim my sanity? The answer hung in the balance as I stood at the edge of the abyss, staring into the void. I felt the world around me begin to distort and writhe, like a living thing that was no longer bound by the laws of reality. The sky turned a deep shade of purple, and the stars shone with an otherworldly glow that seemed to pierce the very soul. I stumbled forward, desperate to escape the clutches of Kelsi Davies' dark world. Every step felt like a betrayal, as if I was walking further into the abyss rather than escaping it. The trees seemed to twist and writhe around me, their branches grasping for me like skeletal fingers. I could feel the weight of madness bearing down upon me, threatening to consume me whole. And yet I pressed on, driven by a desperate desire to break free from the grasp of Kelsi's twisted realm. The world was blurring and shifting around me like a reflection in rippling water. I stumbled and fell, skinning my knee on the rough stone floor. As I looked up, I saw Kelsi standing over me, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly intensity. "You'll never escape," she hissed, her voice like a rusty gate. "You're mine now." I tried to scream, but my voice was frozen in my throat. The world around me seemed to dissolve into chaos, as if reality itself was unraveling before my eyes. I felt myself being pulled down into the depths of Kelsi's dark world, where madness reigned supreme and sanity was a distant memory. And yet, even as I fell, I knew that I had to keep moving. I had to find a way to escape, no matter what horrors lay ahead. For in the darkness there was always hope, if only it could be found. I stumbled through the dark world, desperate to escape the clutches of Kelsi's twisted realm. Every step felt like a betrayal, as if I was walking further into the abyss rather than escaping it. The trees seemed to twist and writhe around me, their branches grasping for me like skeletal fingers. I could feel the weight of madness bearing down upon me, threatening to consume me whole. And yet I pressed on, driven by a desperate desire to break free from the grasp of Kelsi's dark world. As I ran, I stumbled upon a hidden glade, tucked away in the heart of the twisted forest. In the center of the glade stood an ancient tree, its branches twisted and gnarled with age. Carved into the trunk of the tree was a message, etched in a language that seemed to shimmer and glow in the dim light. I stumbled towards the tree, my heart pounding in my chest. As I read the message, I felt a surge of hope rise up within me. It was a warning, left by some long-forgotten traveler who had also tried to escape Kelsi's dark world. "Beware the mirror," it said, "for in its depths lies the true horror." I looked around, wondering what kind of mirror could be hidden in this twisted forest. And then I saw it, a gleaming surface of glass, hanging from a branch high above me. It seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, drawing me towards it like a moth to flame. As I stood before the mirror, I felt a sense of trepidation wash over me. The surface seemed to ripple and distort, like water on a hot day. And then I saw my own face staring back at me, but it was not the face I knew. It was twisted and distorted like a reflection in rippling water. I reached out a trembling hand to touch the glass, and as I did, the mirror shattered into 1,000 shards of glass. The sound was like a scream, echoing through the forest and shattering my eardrums. And then everything went black. When I came to, I found myself back in my own bed, the events of the past few days still etched vividly in my mind. But something was different. Something was off. As I sat up and swung my legs over the side of the bed, I felt a sense of disorientation wash over me. The room seemed to spin around me like a carnival merry-go-round. And then I looked down at my hands and saw that they were no longer mine. They were twisted and distorted like the face in the mirror. I screamed and screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of my own heartbeat. And when the police found me, I was catatonic, my mind shattered by the horrors I had faced in Kelsi's dark world. The story ends here, but the nightmare continues. For in that moment, I knew that I would never be able to escape the darkness that lurked within myself. It had consumed me whole, leaving nothing but a shell of a man in its wake.